Should we start? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this NJ event where we have got David Bernstein giving a talk tonight. David is the CEO and president of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, a passionate advocate for free expression of ideas. Bernstein is past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and a former director of the David Project. He is the author of Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. He will give us a fascinating talk tonight, and what he's talking is very real, because what is seen in America is slowly crossing the Atlantic. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Julius. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for this conversation. As luck would have it, I'm actually in your neighborhood. I am in Oxford right now on a 2-week program teaching about and learning about anti-Semitism, comparing notes with scholars and the like. So it's been wonderful to be with you all and this side of the pond, where, as Julie said, there's certainly signs that a new variant of anti-Semitism is sort of entering the bloodstream. So I want to talk a little bit about what that is, and I thought I would share some slides, if you don't mind. I assume you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I thought I would do is situate the conversation about what you might call woke anti-Semitism. And woke anti-Semitism, I don't just mean progressive anti-Semitism. I mean a very specific variant. But I want to situate it in the larger conversation about ideology. We are living in a very bewildering moment, and people don't have a strong sense of place in society, and there's rapid change, and you have social media that is sort of redefining narratives, and in that environment, just as we had at the sort of at the 20th century, early 20th century, it is fertile ground for various ideologies to take hold on the right and on the left, and of course in the Muslim world as well. And so in the US, I'm not sure how popular it is in the UK, but I believe it is here, is this idea of replacement theory, the idea that ordinary American workers are being replaced by immigrants. And guess who's doing the replacing? It's Jews are doing the replacing. So it's a larger ideology, a larger conspiracy theory in which the Jew plays a very specific role. And I would argue that almost any time you see an ideological trend, set of conspiracy theories, a simplistic framework for understanding the world, anti-Semitism is not far behind. It is the perfect place for anti-Semitism to sort of find its voice. And so I want to talk about woke ideology. And before I do that, I thought maybe I would define it, okay? So I jokingly call it banana ideology because some people get very upset when you use the term woke. I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but use the term woke and people shut down mentally. So I said, let's not give it a name. Let's just talk about what the ideology is. And I joke, I'll call it banana ideology. So what is that? So what is the ideology I'm talking about? It holds two things. First, that racism and bigotry and oppression are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes, but they are embedded and ingrained in the very systems and structures of society. And the second core tenet is that only people with lived experience of oppression are able to understand it and articulate it for the rest of society. Okay, so let me get into that a little deeper. So racism or bigotry is embedded in the very structures of society. It's not just merely that you face somebody's obnoxious prejudicial remark, right? It's that there's an invisible force that's defining your opportunities in life. That's what we're talking about here. Now, that can be true, right? Of course, like, we talk about Jim Crow America, the time when there was, before the civil rights era, when America was pervasively racist against Black people. Some people argue that's still the case today. I think it's changed a lot. It's not perfect. But again, Jim Crow America, certainly a time when America was pervasively racist. Nazi Germany, you could argue, was systemic, of course, was systemically anti-Semitic. No doubt about that, right? These are extreme examples of systemic racism or systemic anti-Semitism. So so it's not that that's never true, but it's not always true. And there are people who are claiming that it is always true. That's part of the ideology. The second piece of this is this ideology of lived experience. Only people who have experienced oppression can define it. So as a Jewish person who's experienced anti-Semitism, and I experienced quite a lot growing up, I would think that people would want to hear me out, right? They should listen to my experiences of anti-Semitism. But I don't have the final say on it. None of us do. You're Jewish too. Your experience of anti-Semitism may be different than my experience, and you have your own perspectives. And I imagine that those perspectives sometimes differ. I also know that lived experience can't be the only data point, right? There's other forms of data. So, for example, the Pew survey. Pew is a major organization that does public surveys in America. Found that American Jews are the most admired religion in America. Now, that's a data point that runs counter to my lived experience. So it can't have the final word. And what happens in this current discourse is we end up with this very rigid hierarchy. And I'm going to explain what you're seeing here. It's called the intersectionality wheel of privilege. And if you attend in the United States, and I would imagine, by the way, in certain corporate settings in the UK as well, if you attend a diversity, equity, and inclusion training session, and it could be in your schools, it could be in your workplace, it could be in your government office, you will have a trainer who will tell you exactly who has power and how much of it and how proximate they are to power. So in the center here, you see power, right? And in the immediate rung outside the center, you see groups like white, Christian, rich, so forth. And these are people who, according to this diversity wheel, have the most power. One rung outside of that, you have less power, is if you're invisibly disabled, you're middle class, you're never married, and it goes really around, and it tells you exactly how much power based on what these various identity markers are. And in the outer rung, you have visibly black or brown people or Asian people. You have poor people and the like. And what they're saying is, we know who has power, and we know exactly how much power they have based on where they are in this weird wheel of intersectionality. Now, you will not find the word Jew on this, and that's a good thing. We don't want to see Jews, explicitly defined. But you can imagine where Jews are going to be slotted in here. We are perceived as white unfairly, by the way, I would argue, like many of us don't identify as white. My mom is an Iraqi Jew, and I'm told by 23andMe that I am 50.4% Western Asian. So I shouldn't have to categorize myself as white, but I'm told I'm white by this discourse. I'm told unless I identify as white, that I'm engaging in a kind of privilege because I don't recognize my own privilege. So the Jews are slotted into the wheel of intersectionality, whether we like it or not. We're told exactly how much power we have. And I think that's where this becomes extremely problematic, because in this ideology, success is conflated with oppression. And guess who are considered the most successful group? In the United States, by the way, it's not just Jews. It's Indians from the subcontinent. It's Chinese Americans and the like. And Jews were all considered white adjacent or complicit in white supremacy because we're considered to have more power. And we're going to break that down a little bit and go into that a little deeper. We've seen this idea of white privilege become very easily Jewish privilege. So, for example, at Stanford University, there was this young senator at Stanford, one of the elite colleges in the United States, who had made comments that it should be acceptable to say that Jews control the banking industry and Jews control the media and the like. And he was rightly, I would say, brought up on charges before the Stanford Student Senate. But during that conversation, and this is fascinating, when everybody was condemning this young man for his anti-Semitic statements, this is what was reported in the Stanford Review. Some stressed the importance of understanding the intersection of white privilege and Jewish privilege before voting on the resolution. So in other words, it was not acceptable to say Jews control the banking industry or the media. Those are the traditional anti-Semitic tropes of the right. But you could get away with saying that we have to talk about the intersection of white privilege and Jewish privilege. This is a permission structure for expressing traditional anti-Semitic tropes that fly beneath the radar screen of the average progressive who has gotten used to thinking in terms of these binary terms of who has power and who doesn't. And so therefore, who is complicit and who is guiltless. Another aspect of this is that Jews are told that we are white, and at least in the U.S. and I imagine in the U.K. that's not always a good thing. This is from a colleague of mine who I think really hit the nail on the head. Jews who have never been seen as white by those for whom being white is a moral good are now seen as white by those for whom whiteness is an unmitigated evil. So Jews are not given a choice as to whether or not they can identify as white, or they do identify as white, but now they're being linked to something that has been demonized. And I think this is, one characteristic of anti-Semitism through the ages, as Dr. Einat Wilf, she's a leading Israeli thinker, former member of the Knesset, said, is that often our societies force us to pay our pound of flesh in order to fit in order to be part of the society. We have to give up some aspect of our identity that's key to our Jewishness. So it may be Zionism in some cases, a young student on college campus who feels that they can't be part of the community of the good unless they explicitly denounce their Zionism. That is an example of paying a pound of flesh. Not being able to identify as any race we want or no race at all is a way of paying our pound of flesh to the current society in order to fit in. This discourse has infected the Jewish community as well, and I'm not sure if this has reached the other side of the pond, the side of the pond I am right now, but these are Jews talking about Jews and whiteness. I'm going to read you the quote. Studying how Jews became white folks should be a prerequisite for white Jews to see how Jewish complicity with whiteness has been harmful. When Ari is somebody who does not go along with this ideology, claims to be a person of color, he is complicit with whiteness because he is refusing to acknowledge his white privilege. So again, many Jews, in order to be part of this discourse, progressive Jews, have really bought in hook, line, and sinker into this ideology and are insisting that their fellow Jews buy in as well. And you can see how dangerous this can become. It's not just an external phenomenon being imposed on us, it is an internal phenomenon as well that many Jews are embracing to stay connected and in sync with the discourse. You can see how this idea of Jews are white can really become an anti-Semitic trope. This is from the actress Whoopi Goldberg. She's somebody who traditionally has been very close to the Jewish community. She named herself Goldberg. That's not her name of birth in order to express her affinity with Jews. But I want to read you this quote that she said on television. Well, this is white people. This is about the Holocaust, by the way, just let's be clear. Well, this is white people doing it to white people, so y'all going to fight among yourselves. If you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. It's about man's inhumanity to man. In other words, her own view of what race was and her own view of what whiteness is and what blackness is made her think that only people in the current American understanding of race could be victims of racism. Now, as anybody who studied the Holocaust knows, is that the Nazis viewed Jews as a race. I mean, if anything, Nazism was a form of racism. Jews were considered an inferior race by Hitler and the Nazis. And yet she couldn't even see that because she's so stuck on her own understanding of this sort of racial binary. And so it's very blinding, and you can see how it easily enables anti-Semitic tropes, like the one we see here from Whoopi Goldberg. I think there's another danger here, and this is from another Brit, Andrew Sullivan. He's a writer and thinker. He lives in the United States, grew up in London. If you replace the word whiteness with Jewishness, by the way, Andrew is not Jewish, this kind of demonizing rhetoric could be straight from a Nazi textbook. It identifies a racial group. It attaches evil characteristics to it. It ascribes those characteristics to individuals within that group, and it sees their success as one at the direct expense of others. The logic of anti-whiteness and anti-Semitism blur over time into the same thing. Again, a lot of people might say, well, as long as they don't blame us Jews, let them demonize white people. but we can easily see how one can blur into the other. And I think part of what we need to defend is not just against how we're portrayed in this discourse, but about how this discourse demonizes people and engages in an ideological binary that I think is very dangerous for us, even if we're not directly implicated. This is a slide that is in my kids' school system right now. It is being taught. Okay, it comes out of something called white supremacy culture. The woman who has devised white supremacy culture is named Tima Okun. She's a professor at Duke, and she devised this idea that certain cultural qualities like being on time are an example of white supremacy. Being on time is white supremacy. And so I want to read you this slide. Now, this is now an iconic figure. These are neo-Nazis who are marching in Charlottesville, and when was that? 2017, I believe. Outside of a synagogue, they are marching outside of a synagogue with their tiki torches, and they're yelling, "Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!" Another horrendous thing. So this is what white supremacy culture has to say. Being honest with ourselves, did we look at this image and think, that's not me? Or I am not that kind of white person? Or not all white people are like those white people? Do we want to view ourselves as good white people and distance ourselves from bad white folks? How does this good-bad binary get in the way of accepting that we are participants and reinforcers of a system of white supremacy? Now, the ironic thing about this is that these white supremacists are protesting outside of a synagogue where those people are characterized as white. So she's conflating the victims inside the synagogue with the victimizers who are out there with their tiki torches. That's how this desensitizes people. It makes them not understand the difference between victimizers and victims. All right, moving on here to another related concept. There is a very popular book in the US. I have no doubt it's made its way to the UK as well. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it's by a Black thinker and professor named Ibram X. Kendi, an international bestseller. And he has an idea called equity that emerges out of this discourse. And he says, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. In Kendi's view, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately the equal footing. Okay. Now, I'm going to read you a quote from Black economist Glenn Loury. He's a brilliant writer and thinker, and how this could become anti-Semitic. One consequence of a fixation on group disparities understood to be the necessary consequence of oppression or racism is that the groups that do well will come under suspicion. Their success will be thought to be the flip side of the disadvantage of the groups that do poorly. If African Americans are underrepresented in this or that venue because of systemic racism, and Jews are, let's say, overrepresented in those very same venues, how can it be otherwise but that the overrepresentation of Jews is somehow the bitter fruit, the necessary consequence of that very system of oppression that excludes African Americans? It strikes me that it does fuel resentment and envy and a kind of antipathy that can easily express itself into violence. So he's explaining how this discourse can easily be weaponized against Jews. Yet another aspect of this is that increasingly in this discourse, Jews are really not considered an oppressed group. A fellow Jewish Brit wrote the book, David Bernstein, Jews Don't Count. You may have seen it. You may have read about it. As you may know, 20 or some odd years ago, there was something called the Million Man March. It was organized by notorious Black racist, Louis Farrakhan, Minister Louis Farrakhan, and a woman named Natalie Hopkinson wrote a piece in the New York Times. This just exemplifies a very specific phenomenon I want you to understand. He wrote about the women of the Million Man March. It was a glowing piece about Louis Farrakhan and the women who helped him put it all together. And a Jewish woman who's at the bottom of this tweet writes, Natalie Hopkinson, your piece in the New York Times makes me sad. I wish your glowing article about Farrakhan was the whole truth. The reality is, whether you like it or not, vile, unrepentant, and relentless anti-Semitism is part of his legacy as well. And she answers, you know what makes me sad? Literally 1 million people involved in this essay. You don't center the marchers. You don't center the Black women who are named and linked. You don't even center Farrakhan. You center yourselves and your feelings. Exactly the problem with history. So she's saying that this woman's complaint about anti-Semitism is nothing more than a whine. She's whining about something. She's trying to take the spotlight off of what she thinks is important and bring it to this idea of anti-Semitism. And we're seeing this over and over again. Anti-Semitism is not a legitimate form of oppression, so therefore it doesn't belong in this conversation. And if you choose to talk about anti-Semitism at many diversity gatherings, you are going to be accused of decentering anti-Blackness. And that is a discourse that I think is very dangerous. Now, as you can well understand, that this ideology has to affect perceptions of Israel. It has to. This binary, this either you're oppressed or oppressor, must affect Israel. And we saw this really on full display in May 2001 during Israel's latest conflict with Hamas and Gaza. I can tell you, I've been following previous rounds of violence between Israel and Hamas and Gaza in 2008, in 2012, 2014, 2018. I probably missed one or two. And I've been looking at how the American press and the international press cover the situation in Gaza. And I can tell you the way it's always gone is that Israel, at least by the New York Times or the Washington Post, is usually given 4 or 5 days to defend itself before the press starts to see the mounting casualties and say the casualties are disproportionate. You hear that word disproportionate, and Israel should cease fire. That did not happen in May 2020. Israel was immediately viewed as the aggressor. And you could see that there was something in the air that was different. There was an ideological ethos that had shifted in American society that was governing the way that many people saw the conflict. And we can pick this up in the numbers. My organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, ran a poll of 1,600 likely voters, Republicans and Democrats, and roughly equal measure, and independents. And we asked this question. There have been ongoing clashes between Israel and Palestinians for many years. Based on what you know, which of the following statements do you agree with more? The blue, Israel is a sovereign nation which has the right and the obligation to defend itself from terrorists intent on killing civilians. And the orange, Israel is an occupier and a colonizer using modern military power to attack defenseless Palestinians. Now, I can tell you that while we don't have an exact comparison, but I know from looking at other polls over the years, that the number of people who are viewing Israel as an occupier or a colonizer is way up, particularly among progressives and very liberal and somewhat liberal people. This was not a popular way of understanding Israel in years past, and it is starting to gain ground on the left. And I think it's very worrying. I'm going to show you polling from the Gallup poll. The Gallup poll has been asking the same question about Israel and Palestinians for over 20 years. And asks you who you're more sympathetic with. This is the Democratic Party, the center-left party in America. And if you look here, this blue line represents Democratic sympathies with Israel every year. So at its high point, 60% of Democrats were sympathetic to Israel, and about 20% were sympathetic with Palestinians. It's been a little higher than that in the past. It's been a little lower than that in the past. But you can see where the line is. Look at 2023. It flipped. 49% now sympathize with Palestinians and 38% with Israelis. That has to be coming from somewhere. I'm sure there's things that are happening in the Middle East that affect this, but there have been many, many more intensive periods in Middle East hostilities and the like that you would think would engender sympathy toward the Palestinians. This is not one of those times, and clearly something is shifting in the ideological attitudes of America that in Americans that are making them think about Israelis and Palestinians differently. So I think we have an issue, and unfortunately, not enough Jewish leaders are naming this problem. Jonathan Greenblatt, who is the president and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, likes to say that anti-Semitism on the right is like a hurricane, and anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. In other words, on the right, it's fast moving, it's violent, it's immediate. On the left, it's slower moving but corrosive. And the fear, of course, on the left is that we're going to go through what you went through in the UK, which is sort of the slow Corbynization of American politics, particularly the Democratic Party. But what Jonathan Greenblatt does not say, what he does not say, is that what the CO2 emissions are, the ideological CO2 emissions that are producing the climate change on the left. He does not say what they are. He'll talk about the ideology on the right that produces anti-Semitism on the right. He'll even talk about the anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, Islamist ideology that produces anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. But he is, and many other Jewish leaders are conspicuously silent when they talk about the increase of anti-Semitism on the left, because they know that if they do it, they will alienate progressives. And that is the problem. So I would urge you all, and I'm going to end here and we can open up for questions, that as this ideology, and I hope it doesn't fully take hold, it is taking hold, but I hope it doesn't go nearly as far as it has in the United States. As it does, you educate your fellow citizens, your fellow Jews about the ideological underpinnings of this anti-Semitism. They have to know that this idea of dividing people simplistically into the oppressors and the oppressed, and looking at the entire complex social dynamics through that very narrow lens, is inevitably going to produce anti-Semitism, and it's going to inevitably produce anti-Zionism. And unfortunately, that's where we are in the United States. Too many American Jews are not even willing to name the problem. I hope you'll do it differently. So why don't I stop there and let's have Q&A, and I'll stop sharing this so I can see your faces. And Julius, do you want? I see Jonathan Isaacs.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. You can go ahead and facilitate it.
Can I kick off first with the observation? There's
Sure.
a problem starting in UK schools, but up to perhaps 50% of the schools in London are starting to teach critical race theory. One of the ministers, Kate Badenoch, actually turned around and said, if I get the quote in front of me, teachers who presented the idea of white privilege as a fact to their students were breaking the law, and described critical race theory as an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. I would like sort of your views, comments on that.
I mean, I think that's exactly what's happened through schools in the United States. And unfortunately, we didn't push back early enough to prevent it from becoming the new normal. It has become the new normal. It is being taught that way in schools around the United States. You know, about a year ago or so, I heard that the American school in London was really trying to embrace the ideology, and there was tremendous pushback that actually led them to move away from it, which was very good to hear. I can't name you a single major private school in the United States or a major district, public school district, where that kind of pushback led to them to actually pull away from it. So this is being taught to kids around the United States. And there's very nasty versions of this that are being taught that are coming out of California. It's called ethnic studies. And ethnic studies goes a step further. It not only divides everybody into oppressed and oppressors, but it specifically looks through what you call a settler colonialist lens. So countries like the UK, the US, and Israel are settler colonialist states. And they specifically call Israel a settler colonialist state. Let me actually show you a slide from this since I still have, I'm going to show you an example from this curriculum so you can see what this looks like. I did leave this out of the presentation. Okay. Yes, this right here. This is right out of the Boston City schools. This is being taught now. It's not something I am speculating about. So it's trying to explain to people what's happened to the indigenous populations of all these places. So you see the United States. Look at the map of Israel on the sort of upper left. Okay, the green is the Palestinian population prior to 1948. The UN partition plan created this, and then from 1949 to 1967, this is what actually existed. And today, this is where Palestinians supposedly rule. This is obviously a very skewed narrative. I mean, it completely leaves out the Israeli Arab population in the modern state of Israel, as if they have no standing. And it pretends that Palestinians were in charge of all of Palestine prior to 1948. Absolutely skewed. That is the narrative that's being taught. And unfortunately, I like to say that dogma begets ever more radical forms of dogma. So you start with this simplistic and narrative of oppressed versus oppressor, and you end up empowering radicals who teach the social studies and teach history in the most extreme forms. This is really a neo-Marxist framework and is being taught in schools now, and it is spreading in the United States. Sorry to scare you. We're working very hard to push back against it, by the way, and have had some success in certain school districts, but it ain't easy. Julius, should we call on the next person? You're on mute.
Sorry, that was great. Thank you. Echoes, I think, a lot of our concerns here. Jonathan, you have raised your hand?
Yes. Very kind of you to come and speak to us, Mr. Bernstein. I've read your book, Woke Antisemitism, which I found extremely disturbing. And listening to you tonight takes me to one of your conclusions in the book, or remedies of a big tent for social justice, in which perhaps you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you advocate Jews of various social attitudes getting together in a big tent, and at the very end of your book you actually specify in a diagram which kind of Jews can come into the big tent and which are excluded. And I wonder whether any of this in this country, given the incredibly divided nature of Anglo Jewry politically, is feasible.
Okay, so first of all, let me just clarify what I mean by some of that. I talk about a big social justice tent because in recent years, this idea of tikkun olam, or Jewish social justice, has been sort of hijacked by one single ideological camp. So it's not. I might argue that going to the soup kitchen and helping out at the soup kitchen is an act of Jewish social justice. I might I have a very politically conservative friend of mine who's very active in disability causes. He doesn't believe that all oppression can be traced to white people, and that's the only acceptable explanation of disparity. But he does have a big heart, and he wants to help. And to me, that's Jewish social justice. There are solutions that come out of market-based solutions that political conservatives might have that might sound very different from what Jewish social justice warriors on the left might have to say. And I'm saying two things about that. One is that political moderates and conservatives should be welcomed into the social justice conversation. And two, political moderates and conservatives should insert themselves in the conversation because they have creative solutions to society's problems as well. So it's not that we all have to work together. We don't have to do the same thing at the same time, but we do. But what I am saying is that being socially conscious, wanting to make the world a better place, is central to who we are as Jews. We don't have to deny that or pretend it's just a leftist luxury item, but rather we can do it in ways that are consistent with our own values and approaches. And I think that's missing. I don't recall. I know which diagrams I think you're talking about, but I'm not trying to define the Jewish community there. I'm trying to say that there are groups in America that I think can be our new allies. There are Asian American groups and Black American groups, Indian groups, Hindu groups, and the like, who don't share this ideology. They don't share the extreme right ideology, and they don't share the extreme left ideology. And I'm sure there are analogs in the UK as well to this. That there are groups. I can tell you, I've met many of them. I was in the UK about I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago, and I went in a conference in Cambridge, and we met with Nigerian and Caribbean leaders in the UK who did not support this ideology. They were extremely opposed to it, and they were worried it was starting to gain ground in the UK. Those are allies. Those are people that the Jewish community can get to know that might diverge from some of the allies that maybe we've all been making over the years. A lot of times we think we should be, you make peace with your enemies. You hear that over and over again. I think that, okay, fine, make peace with your enemies. I'm sure that there are people that we should get to know in the Muslim community. Not that all Muslims are our enemies, but we should know people in the Muslim community. I think we pay short shrift to people who are natural allies. So what about those Nigerian Brits and those Caribbean Brits who share a common narrative? They don't want British society to embrace this idea that they're all oppressed by virtue of their skin color. Those, I think, are natural allies, and I would hope, if you haven't already, that you spend some time getting to know them.
Thank you very much.
Julius, you're muted.
No. Does anyone else have any more questions? Tom Griffith, would like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I just want to pick up that theme of natural allies. I think the Jewish I've understood, and I'm not Jewish, but you can describe it in many different ways, is something that's touched the whole world over 2,000 years. And it's touched different areas of the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran, and areas in the Mediterranean. And I would suggest, in addition, you talked about natural allies. I meet many people from African communities. You've just mentioned certain groups here in Britain who are concerned about the threat of militant Islamism in Africa. So how do you do that? How do you do it? And I want to make a suggestion to you sometimes, and I'm aware of this. I know, but it's better for a particular theme. I'm involved in human trafficking and modern slavery. It's sometimes better for someone from within a certain community to speak and be an advocate for that group. I recognize the value of that. So I'm going to suggest to you, David, and the other people at NGA, if you want to build natural allies, bring them into your movement, not just only as non-Jews, but within the Jewish world. You have Black people within the Jewish identity, both in America and Britain, less so in Britain, and across Israel. And you have people from, let's call it, I'm going to use the phrase Sephardi background, from the Middle East backgrounds. Incorporate them to be your spokesman.
Sure. The number two in my
because one of the ways, often, and I've seen it happen, you're just seen always East Europeans, and that's who you are. That's who Jewish people are. You're just East Europeans. It's an important part of your identity. You don't neglect that, cherish that, but you're not exclusively so. You're a global identity, and you should promote that in the way you promote these narratives. I wish you well in that.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I will say that the number two in my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, is a woman named Brandy Shafetinsky. She's a Black Jewish woman, very powerful, eloquent voice. I'm at this conference of anti-Semitism at Oxford with one of her sons, Dimitri. So we are absolutely trying to bring forth diverse voices in our own community to help make the case. You know, one thing I've heard from many Black Americans, and I also heard it from Black British folks when I was in Cambridge, is that they don't necessarily want their children to be taught that the system is rigged against them, even if it is rigged against them, because it disadvantages them. They want them to have a narrative of opportunity. And so I think finding those people, and it's work. You have to go out and find these people. They may be a little less vocal than the more established groups. They haven't been around that long. They're responding to the current discourse, so they're newer. Just like my organization is a new organization that's responding to the current discourse. So you have to go out and sort of find out who they are, you know. And it might take a little time, but you'll find we've really been building connections to all kinds of new allies, and I would hope that you'll consider doing the same.
Yeah. Thanks for the challenge. I'm up for it.
Can I intercede here? There was an interesting article in the FT a few days ago, which spoke about sort of the Americans' sort of non-graduate sort of Bami Americans, and they do not believe critical race theory is right at all. It's a very interesting FT article. If anyone wants a copy of it, I'm very happy to forward it on to them. If you just contact Dahlia in the NJA office, I will forward the article on to you. But it basically said the people who are allegedly the victims do not agree with the theory, and it doesn't resonate with them.
Yeah, you'll see that with a lot of people. Absolutely.
And if you want a copy, Tom, it would be a pleasure to share it with you. Great. Does anyone else have any questions? No other questions? Well, I would like to sum up by, number one, promoting your book, which I think is absolutely excellent. I have read it, as has Lynn has read it, and I think I have it somewhere here.
By the way, I know for a fact it's available on Amazon in the UK, because I ran out of copies here and I wanted to give them to other.
Sorry, it's on Amazon. I do have a link for it, but that's not the one. Here it is. The right one's come up. It's available on Amazon. Thoroughly recommend it. Woke Antisemitism: How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. You order it today, you'll have it tomorrow. Thoroughly recommended.
Thank you.
I'll leave that screen for a few seconds so anyone who wants to write down details can. And if there are no more questions, I'm just having a look. I can't see anyone having their hand up. I would like to thank you very much for an excellent talk tonight, sort of reinforcing concerns I think a lot of us have of what may happen in the UK. And wish you every success with the work you're doing. Now,
thank you so much.
With a group called Harif, and with Harif at the end of the meeting, we normally unmute everyone so everyone can say thank you, raise in a more casual framework way any little questions. So everyone is now unmuted, and if you want to ask a question, please ask them in a orderly manner. Thank you. So everyone can now unmute themselves and make a comment if you want to.
Can I ask if the slides from this presentation will be available? Because I think that would be very helpful.
I'll send them to Julius. Absolutely. I'll send them to Lawrence.
Thank you.
Right.
Shall I make a comment?
Oh, my wife, Lynn, wants to come and say hello.
Hello there. Actually, I just had a worrying thought, which is that, I mean, the gentleman who mentioned Sephardi Jews can be used to sort of advocate for Jews in general. There are Sephardi Jews or even Ashkenazi Jews who make a distinction between Jews of color, say that they are Jews of color, which then implies that the Ashkenazim are not Jews of color. And I find this very worrying. I don't know if you do too, but because it shows that, the rest of them are all white settler colonialists.
Yes, that's a very good point, Lynn.
Good point.
But yes, that is a very good point. And it's, and yes, we're accepting a certain self-definition if we accede to that, to that. And in the U.S. discourse, Mizrahi Jews generally do not fall under the definition of Jews of color. That's because probably most Mizrahi Jews don't want to be deemed Jews of color. That just doesn't apply to their experience in any way. Let me just tell you how crazy this discourse gets. There was a study done on the number of Jews of color by a very political organization within the Jewish community. And two distinguished Jewish demographers, and they said this study showed that there were 12 to 15% Jews of color in America today. And two distinguished Jewish demographers took issue with the numbers. They said that could not possibly be the case considering the most recent demographic data that we had from like 2013, which showed that there were 6% Jews of color. So there's no way it went from 6 to 12 to 15% Jews of color. These two Jewish demographers were raked over the coals. There was a petition drive signed by 2,500 Jews condemning them for their remarks, and the leaders of the reform movement in the United States accused them of white intellectualism. I kid you not, white intellectualism for for disagreeing with the number of Jews of color. It was a very sensitive article, by the way. It was an article, all they did was, they said that we should be a more inclusive community, but they said that the numbers are wrong and it's important that we have the numbers right. So and that was in 2020, and that's when I thought things were really coming off the rails. That, here two scholars cannot even talk honestly and openly about demographics, or else they'll be called a racist. And so if you catch signs of that, I urge you all to push back quickly.
Right. Well, an anecdote here.
Got her hand up there.
Yeah. Can I just have one quick anecdote? We go to a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in London. My wife founded and runs Harif. They think I look like a Sephardi and she looks like the Ashkenazi. Totally the wrong way around. Tom, you want to speak? Far away. Everyone, you can unmute yourself. Tom?
Yeah, I've unmuted. That's a valid point, and I get it fully. Just a point I made before. I'm not saying your representative should be exclusively black or Sephardi, whoever they define by the outside world. You should just show within the teams that you have here in Britain, America, and elsewhere that you're a diverse community with voices and understanding in different parts of the world. But I really get this point. I understand what you're trying to say. One of the things I was involved on another matter totally was a few years ago was over the census teams and how you categorize race within the census in the UK. And clearly, Jewishness doesn't come into a category. You've got a whole list of things. And some races have, and some haven't, such as Gypsy, Roma, and Travellers. And this goes back to other questions which go beyond this, the themes of this talk about how the Jewish community defines itself in terms of these forms and whether it welcomes them or not, and different angles and that. I recognize those dilemmas, and it's a very valid one. If you try to totally play their game and just play it, I really get your concerns. But I do think it's important to represent the diversity of visions and outlooks within Jewish identity, wherever you are. And I think that can only be a good thing for people who say, you are just that. The community, and we all benefit from listening to those diverse voices.
Agreed.
I think we have lost.
We have Terry.
Yeah, we have Terry now. I think we have lost Mr. Griffith, unfortunately. I think his internet has gone down. Terry.
Oh,
hi, thank you. Yeah, I just worry really about a bit like you, Lynn, about the divisions that we define ourselves through: the Jews of color, Jews of non-color, Jews, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, secular, religious. I think the more we are divided, the more we're going to be weaker. And, liberal versus conservative, all these divisions are not helpful, and they are the least helpful to Jews, but to humanity as a whole as well. But Jews need to stick together.
Right. Look, it's hard not to create identifiers at all. People from similar backgrounds sometimes want to spend time with similar backgrounds. A Jew from Persia may want to go to a synagogue with other Persian Jews, and they want to identify themselves. Russian Jews have a distinct experience given their upbringing in the former Soviet Union. So I don't know that we can completely rid ourselves of identifiers, but I don't think we want to take on those that are ultimately sort of racially divisive in this way if we can. Right.
Because then we end up in a situation where you're an okay Jew, you're not an okay Jew. You're a colonizer, you're a Jew of color. So yeah, that's the reason I raised the point. Thank you very much.
Harry.
Yeah, thanks. I want to say I totally agree with Lynn that I get the point about showing the diversity within the Jewish community, but I agree with Lynn that we mustn't play their game of saying, oh, look, we've got some black people in our community, that makes us okay, with the implication that the rest of us aren't okay. And I think this comes down to the idea of what are the Jewish people? Are we just a religious group, a faith group? And that's the way the census looks at us. Now, whenever I'm faced with an ethnic identity form that doesn't mention Jewish, I always complain. And if there's an other category, I always tick other and say Jewish, because it seems to me that ethnic identity is not about where we fit on a sort of Dulux color chart. It's because there are endless shades of people, quite obviously. It is about ethnic identity, and one of the things I always mention is that the Hebrew Bible has no word that translates as religion, but it has loads of words that translate as people or nation. And I think this is really important. We mustn't play their game in terms of arguing within their categories.
Yeah, I think that's very well taken, Harry. I agree completely. By the way, I always say don't check the box to other Jews. There's no reason why we have to allow ourselves to be defined according to those categories. They're completely arbitrary categories. I mean, just take the Asian category, for example, which is, one in the U.S. So what does an Iranian woman and an Chinese American woman have in common? I mean, they're put into the same, flattened into the same identity categories. It's an absurdity. And yet we're asked to put ourselves into those same arbitrary and socially constructed categories. It makes no sense at all. The other thing that this brought to mind for me is that it puts us in a bit of a strategic dilemma. So when an ideology like this starts to gain ground, many Jews will say, well, let's get ourselves in on it. Let's get ourselves defined as one of the indigenous categories. So we'll be viewed as oppressed ourselves, and therefore we'll gain greater political gravitas, and we'll have more influence within the movement. And I think that's the exact wrong approach. I understand it, by the way. A lot of people want to do that. That's our instinct. But you end up playing the oppression Olympics, and we don't fare well in the oppression Olympics, because even though, yes, Jews were just, whatever is how many decades ago now that is, victims of the Holocaust, and we've been victims in more modern times as well. Because we're on average a more successful community, we will be conflated with the oppressor. You just can't get out of that bind in this ideology, because it so explicitly conflates financial success and educational success with oppression. So I think our best bet is to reject the entire framework. And I think that's also the intellectually honest thing to do. It is an absurd intellectual framework. It claims to be able to tell you exactly who's oppressed and who the oppressors are. That's ridiculous. No one can do that. It's complicated out there. And so we should reject it on intellectual grounds, but we should also reject it because we just can't win in it.
Great. I think as we have no more questions, I think I'd like to thank everyone for a very lively and interesting discussion tonight. I think we had quality in the audience, although perhaps not the quantity we'd hope. I'd like to thank David for an excellent talk. I would thoroughly recommend everyone to actually advocate for what David has been talking about and fighting, giving pushback against critical race theory. And if you want a good read on a long plane flight on a holiday this summer, Woke Antisemitism is the book for you.
Thanks a million, everybody. Thank you, Lawrence. Nice to see you, Lynn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.